Today we're going to talk all about motion, and motion is one of those interesting things that I like to use to add to my photography to make things more interesting, dynamic, or kind of abstract or conceptual. It's a lot of what I've been experiencing and creating with in the past year or so, and I think it's been a lot of fun just visually, and so I'd like to share a lot of the things that I've learned with you guys. Nothing that I'm going to be sharing today is new or inventive or anything like that. I've learned them from other people, and a lot of people have done them before. Something to be understood is that motion is kind of like a frosting on the cake for photography. It's not going to make your images good, and if you don't understand photography in the sense of the basics, it can actually ruin some of your images. So I would often recommend, if you're just starting out or you're new, to get good with exposure, composition, and framing first before you consider adding something like motion into your photography. And so there's a lot of different ways to think or go about creating motion. I'll just express them in the terms that are most familiar with me. Of course, they probably have their other own technical terms to them, but the verbiage that is being used in this video doesn't matter. It's just how I like to think about it and express it. So there are generally two different ways to create motion in your images, and they have two components. One is shutter speed and one is camera motion. So shutter speed, you can shoot with a high or a slow shutter speed, fast or slow, whatever. And camera motion, you can have static or dynamic, static being like on a tripod, dynamic being motion within the frame or with your own hands. So the first thing I want to touch on is what I would like to call freezing time. And this is just a fancy way of me thinking about it. But really what this is probably, in my opinion, the most versatile of the ways to use motion in your photography. And it's what you'll see often in a lot of candid and street photography. And it involves using a fast shutter speed, something like 1/250th of a second or 1/500th of a second. And it involves like having a static frame. So basically what you're doing is you're just taking a candid shot of the moment as it's happening, freezing time essentially. And it's one of the generally the more basic types and easiest types of motion. It might not even be motion in your photography since you're pretty much just stopping time. But what I think is the most fun about this is that it's pretty endless, and you can shoot at fast shutter speeds for pretty much all your photography to capture these candid moments or the moments as they're happening. And you can use it in all sorts of scenarios. So that's why I deem it as the more versatile types of motion. The second, which is kind of like a 1.A because it kind of blends off of this first point, is what I would call implied motion. And this involves using similarly a fast shutter speed, but more of a dynamic motion within your frame. And so this can be when you're shooting a candid and you're catching a motion of someone like throwing a ball, an action is being done, someone's jumping off a cliff or something like that. And so essentially what you're doing is you're catching frames at a fast shutter speed such that motion or trajectory of an action is implied, because it's really the same thing as what you're doing in the first point, which is your freezing time, but you're using it at a certain time period when it's perfect such that we can tell that something is happening, and it's more dynamic of a shot than just simply capturing a candid or a still frame, because it's not really anything new. It's more of an extension of freezing a frame such that things or motion is implied. And so that pretty much sums it up for the fast shutter speed type motion shots. Now we're going to get into the long exposure or the slow shutter speed. And the first form of this is just simply a static long exposure. And I don't do too much of this, but this is what you'll see often that a lot of photographers do in astrophotography, or they'll do like freeway light trails, where you just set up a camera on a tripod, you shoot for a long period of time, maybe like 14 seconds or even as long as like 30 minutes or something like that. And you're able to capture either stars moving in the sky or cars moving on the freeway. And it's a really cool way of capturing and adding motion to your images. Again, I don't do this too much because I like shooting handheld a lot, so I don't have a lot of examples to show you guys. But I think another way you can do this also as well is to do it handheld, but not expose your frame for as long of a period as you would be doing if you had a tripod. And then you can catch some kind of quick motions. Like I only really have like one example of this, and it's a biker passing by, and then I caught it at a slow shutter speed, so it looks like you can see the blur going by. And I think that's a fun thing to try and add to your photography as well. And the final form of motion that I like to add in my photography is something I've been having a lot of fun with, at least in the past year or so, and it involves dynamic long exposures. And so essentially we're going to be exposing our frame at a slow shutter speed like we did in all the other things, but instead of leaving our camera static and on a tripod or static still with our hands like that, we're going to be adding motion with our hands. And this is when photography starts to feel more like painting. And you might look a little crazy when you're doing it because you're doing all these kind of motions. But essentially what you're doing is you're exposing your frame for a longer period of time, maybe half of a second to a second, and you're catching the camera motion over this long period of time to create something interesting. And this is where we delve into the realm of abstract and more conceptual art, because some of these images, they come out looking like things that I have not ever expected or intended to create when doing it. And that's why I think it's so fun to do long exposures this way, is because you never know what you're gonna get. And it's always fun to try and experiment different things. So sometimes I'll have still images of buildings or people on top of a hill, and then I'll add motion over a second or two to create something interesting. And I think the best time of day to do this type of photography is either during like late golden hour or blue hour, because when you do long exposures, it can be tough to get the exposure right because things can tend to be overexposed unless you have like a variable ND filter or something like that. So that's why I like to do these types of shots later in the day during blue hour when things get a little darker, and then the exposure gets a little better. And it also works really well during blue hour and sunset because the colors are really, really nice. So you can end up with a lot of interesting kind of strokes you'll get with light trails or even just the skies and the colors in the sun. So this is something I would 100% recommend to try out just because it's a lot of fun and it's really interesting. It's changed the way I see photography personally into being less of a capturing the moment thing and more of creating something visually as well. So that's what I think is the biggest differences between these different forms, is that a lot of fast shutter speed type shots tend to be more capturing the moment, and a lot of longer exposure or dynamic stuff tends to be more like creating the moment a little bit or doing something interesting. And I think there's no better or worse, it's just a lot of fun. So hopefully this video was able to create some insight into how you can use motion to add to your own photography. If you like this video and would like to see more photography, creativity, productivity type stuff, please subscribe to this channel to see more, and hopefully it was an enjoyable watch for you. Thank you guys as always for watching. I'll see you guys in another video. See ya.